Hello and welcome back to another video. This time I will be covering the topic of consequences as well as some of my thoughts on the differences between the consequences of ideas and the consequences of actions. Now, in order to start off, I would like to talk about the consequences of people's actions, and I think the best quote to kind of start this off with is one that you've most likely heard from some form of mentor figure or someone with a greater deal of wisdom. And to basically summarize it, the quote goes as follows, which is, too much of anything is bad. Now, when you really take this quote apart, or when you try and analyze it to a degree where you want to make it more specific, or you want to boil it down to, really the hard-hitting ideas, why does the quote work as well as it does, I think a better way of wording it would be, any one thing taken to an extreme can have consequences. And I think this can apply to both actions and ideas, but in a more practical sense, it mostly applies to people's actions. And the reason behind that is because, well, we're human. We don't know where the limits of everything is, and as such, for a lot of things, we try and push to the extreme. We try and see, or rather get feedback from the world around us to see what works and what doesn't. And to an extent, I think that's why the saying works as well as it does, because naturally speaking, if you push something hard enough, well, eventually you're going to feel some degree of pushback, and I think that's where the origin of this quote comes from, where people say too much of anything is bad, or the way I'd like to say it is, any one thing taken to an extreme has consequences, and that's true to an extent. Our own actions, in ways that we can't always fathom, come back to us, no matter how trivial versus how, meaningful or how heavy those decisions are. Could be as simple as drinking a glass of water to running down the street or choosing to murder someone. Those are decisions that, without a doubt, come back to you in some way, shape, or form. And when you really think about it, that applies to almost every decision that you've ever made in your life. In some way, it will come back to you. All you need to do is think about it. Now, what I've heard a lot, or what I think a lot of people would think in a situation like that would be, well, we can't always understand the consequences of our actions, because we live in a real world, and in the world we live in, there's so many variables and factors to take into account that you could never possibly truly understand the consequences of any one decision you make. Going back to the glass of water example that I provided, let's say you drink a glass of water. Well, maybe a short-term consequence of that is, well, the water is not filtered and you end up having a stomach ache. Versus a longer-term consequence of that same action being that turns out that unfiltered water contains some kind of life-threatening disease and you get hospitalized for a year. In that sense, you can never really know the extent to which your decisions have consequences, but you still make them. And so a lot of people, what they would argue is, well, I can never truly understand or fully comprehend the consequences of my actions, so why should I care? And as much of an understandable train of thought that is, to an extent, even though we can't fully comprehend something, we can always estimate. And I think that's one of the main reasons why people make the decisions they do, is because, well, we're human, we estimate. We try and predict the future as best we can based off the information that we have, and we either succeed or we fail. If you look at that glass of water which isn't filtered, you'll probably see that it's not very clear, and based off of that, you either think to yourself, well, it's nothing, it's just water from the tap, what's the worst that could happen? Or B, you think to yourself, well, that's not very clean and I would not like to put that on my body. You don't know the full extent you don't know the full extent of the consequences of that decision, but you still make something of it. And in a sense, I think that's a pretty good way of looking at consequences. I think the word gets, how do I say this? People have a very bad view of the word consequence. When you tell someone, oh, this action will have consequences, they always assume the negative, they always assume the bad, because, anything that's good, they automatically assume to be a reward. They assume it to be earned, not given by chance, versus a consequence, which is something they can never predict, or something they assume to be negative. And even though that perception isn't necessarily incorrect, I think consequence, more broadly speaking, just applies to anything that is a result of your decisions. And from this, I would like to address another part of the idea of consequence, and a discussion that I recently came across, which I found to be interesting to say the least. And it was the idea that, well, say you make a decision. Isn't your decision technically the consequence of everyone else's decision? And based off of that, to what extent do you have free will to even make a decision? Is any part of your life your own, or is it all just the result of everyone else's decisions? Now, logically speaking, to a lot of people that makes perfect sense, and to me for a long time it made sense. But the more I thought about it, the more I saw some holes in that way of thinking, and the best way I could kind of show that would be to go through an example. Say someone says, well, all of my actions are based on the actions of others and are a consequence of their actions, so I'm not held accountable for any of my own. Well, you could argue that, well, where did the first action ever originate from? And they would probably argue, well, it probably originated when the first creature to ever live was created, or some way of describing life and its randomness. And then you could, if you continue that train of thought, you'd eventually end up at the Big Bang. And then from there, a lot of what people argue is, well, what if the outcome of the Big Bang would always be the same, or versus if it was true random? Because based on just human resources, we don't know what came before the Big Bang. We don't know if it can only happen the way it did, or if it could have happened in an unknown number of different ways, and we just happen to be in the one that we're in. So to that extent, you would then argue about the existence of true random, or whether everything is preordained. And I guess that's one way of arguing against the idea that every action is preconceived, which is, well, true random exists. It could be in anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be just the Big Bang. You see, while that's one argument, I think another argument that much better suits that kind of a discussion would be a simple, I guess, simulation, if you'd like to call it, or maybe, I guess, an example just in a void. Say you tell that same person to do something they wouldn't necessarily like, and they retaliate. Well, if you ask them, why didn't you do what I said, aren't your actions just the consequence of someone else's actions in a sense? Well, they would probably refute with, oh, well, a lot of other people instilled in me the fact that I shouldn't do this, or I don't want to do this. And then I guess in a response to that, you could just ask them a very simple question, which is, well, why do you care about the number of people that tell you not to do something? Why is the quantity of people who say something the metric that you consider to be the only metric? Did you come up with that yourself, or were you told that that metric is the correct metric? If they respond with the fact that, well, they came up with it themselves and they've already outplayed it, or they've already, how do I say this? They've already gone against their own argument, which is, I have no free will, because they actively chose what to believe. And if they say no, they were told by someone else, then you could very easily ask them the question of, well, why don't you stop believing in that? If you're so easy to change your mind, depending on who tells you what, then why don't you do what I say versus what someone else says? And if they argue, oh, well, because I've known it for longer, then you ask them the same question with regards to time. You ask them what made time the metric that you value the most, who told you that? And if you continue that train of thought, well, you'd eventually end up at a point where they have no choice but to admit to the fact that, well, they chose a metric by which they want to, I guess, carry out their actions or believe what they do. And in a sense, I'd say a lot of people don't really go through this train of thought. They always stay on the part where, oh, well, all of my actions are the consequences of others. It's a disturbing way of thought, mainly because it relieves you of any form of responsibility, and I think to a lot of people that's not a good thing. And I'm not just saying that because, well, people being irresponsible is inadvertently bad and can lead to horrible things happening. No, I mean it in the sense that people who don't feel any control in their lives, even when it comes to their own decisions, those people would not be happy. Those people would feel like their life is meaningless to an extent, and I guess that would be one of the greatest consequences of thought or ideas, which is they affect your life more than you would imagine. You know, if you told someone that they had no free will and every action that they ever made was preordained, and that everything they will do is preordained, and that everything that has happened is meant to happen, you know, it's basically, to go back to the first point of my discussion, it's the idea of destiny taken to an extreme. It's, well, everything is so preordained by some power beyond you that you have no choice in anything. And people often either accept that way of thought and they think to themselves their life has no point and they end up depressed, or they try and retaliate, and usually that retaliation doesn't end up well as well, because for a lot of people the only way to retaliate with that would be, well, nobody told me to kill myself, why don't I do that? And you really need to think to yourself whether that's the result of underlying emotional, I guess, drama or baggage. I don't think drama is the right word for that, but underlying emotional baggage, or whether that's truly in retaliation, in which case it's not very effective because, well, you took your own life, and to prove what? To prove that your life wasn't preordained? That doesn't prove anything, and I think that train of thought carried out, I think that those actions are the consequences of ideas, and that's why I think a lot of people should care a lot more about their ideas and what they think of the world around them, because if you don't carry out your own ideas, and this is why I brought up the first example with too much of anything is bad, basically, is why don't you take them to the most extreme you could take them, to almost depressing levels of, I guess, size, just to see whether a regular human being would be able to survive in those conditions with those thoughts. And I think what a lot of people come away from that, in a sense, or what they take away from that is, well, no one set of ideas would be capable of, I guess, helping us survive as much as possible. And I think, I don't really know how to word this well, but I think the best way I could say it is this: there's no one idea that is fundamentally true or correct. Well, I'm assuming there are certain philosophers who have proven that wrong, and there are like maybe a handful of ideas that are just fact, but I don't know. That's not my place to speak. But what I can say is, well, no one idea or no one viewpoint can really be, the viewpoint that you view everything by. Because going back to the example of you having no agency in your life or having no choice in it because it's just a consequence of other people's actions, you take that to an extreme and you end up with someone who either has depression or wants to retaliate with every fiber of their being, and that ultimately results in the same fate, which is just death, either by their own hand or by some other means while they try and retaliate, or maybe just suicide due to their depression. But what I'm trying to get to is, I think the reason behind that is, you shouldn't really ever rely on one idea or one viewpoint to, explain everything that you experience, but rather a set of ideas, all of which, they all fit in their part of your life to an extent. And I think most people already do that anyways, but they don't really acknowledge it or think about it too much. And that's why I kind of brought up the example of people who say, well, I can't be held accountable for my actions because all of my actions are the result of someone else's. And to an extent, they could say that. They have every right to say that. If someone has emotionally hurt them, if someone betrayed their trust, it's natural for them to develop issues surrounding those problems or surrounding those people's actions. But for them to go further on and then relieve themselves of any form of responsibility in any given situation is when you take an idea too far. At that point, they should assume a different idea, in my opinion at least, or just go with a different viewpoint, or more individualist, more assuming responsibility for everything they do. And I guess, that's overall the message of this video, which is thoughts and actions have their consequences both in their own ways, and in a lot of ways they always end up intertwined because our ideas are what lead us to do certain actions, to carry them out. And I think that's important because if we don't understand the consequences of our own ideas, then how could we understand the consequences of our own actions? Which is, well, why I wanted to talk about it. And with that, I think I want to wrap this video up. Thank you for listening.